Joshua 12, starting in verse 1. Now these are the kings of the land whom the sons of Israel defeated, and whose land they possessed beyond the Jordan toward the sunrise, from the valley of the Arnon as far as Mount Hermon, and all the Arabah to the east. Sihon, king of the Amorites, who lived in Heshbon and ruled from Aroer, which is on the edge of the valley of the Arnon, both the middle of the valley and half of Gilead, even as far as the brook Jabbok, the borders of the sons of Ammon, and the Arabah as far as the sea of Chinneroth toward the east, and as far as the sea of Arabah, even the Salt Sea, eastward toward Beth Jeshimoth, and on the south at the foot of the slopes of Pisgah, and the territory of Og, king of Bashan, one of the remnant of the Rephaim, who lived at Ashtaroth and at Edrei, and ruled over Mount Hermon and Selecah, and all Bashan, as far as the border of the Geshurites and Maccathites, and half of Gilead, as far as the border of Sihon, king of Heshbon. Moses, the servant of the Lord, and the sons of Israel defeated them, and Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave it to the Reubenites and the Gadites and the half-tribe of Manasseh as a possession. Now these are the kings of the land whom Joshua and the sons of Israel defeated beyond the Jordan toward the west, from Baal-Gad in the valley of Lebanon, even as far as Mount Halak, which rises toward Seir. And Joshua gave it to the tribes of Israel as a possession according to their divisions. And then the rest of the chapter goes on to recount the kings that Joshua defeated. And at the end, in verse 24, it says, in all 31 kings. This morning, in meditating on these verses, what really strikes me is this idea that in verse 6, Moses, the servant of the Lord, and the sons of Israel defeated them. And Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave it to the Reubenites and the Gadites and the half-tribe of Manasseh as a possession. And then in verse 7, now these are the kings of the land whom Joshua and the sons of Israel defeated beyond the Jordan toward the west. The difference between these two verses, verses 6 and 7, is that in verse 6, it is Moses, the servant of the Lord, and the sons of Israel. And in verse 7, it is Joshua and the sons of Israel. And it speaks to me this morning about the next generation. It speaks to me this morning about those who will come after me, who will come after us. It speaks to me about the need and the question of, am I living for this next generation? You know, there's a shift in identity that's occurring in the people of Israel. When Israel, Jacob, went down to the promised land, sorry, not the promised land, Egypt, they weren't a nation. They were a tribe. 70-something people. Not a lot. And then they went from a tribe to a people. Millions. But they weren't yet a nation. And then they became slaves. They went from being a freed tribe to an enslaved people. And then they were a free people under Moses, but they weren't a nation yet. And under Joshua, they became a nation. And what strikes me here is just that transition of the previous generation having done its work so that the next generation can flourish. In Moses' time, an enslaved people were becoming free, and they fought a few battles. They fought a couple battles. They won enough territory for the Reubenites and the Gadites and the half-tribe of Manasseh. So they won enough territory for 2.5 tribes. Moses won battles. The bulk of Moses' work was taking an enslaved people and making them free, and then taking a free people and wandering them through the wilderness until the generation that God wanted to bring into the promised land was ready. And then at the end of his life, he gets to taste the fulfillment of the promise as the Gadites and the Reubenites and the half-tribe of Manasseh fight for their possession. And then he hands it over to Joshua. And Joshua goes and defeats 31 kings to establish Israel as a nation. And there's two things that speak to me today. One of them is that the work that the previous generation has done cannot be discounted, because the current generation is here on the basis of what the previous generation has done. The previous generation wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. And yet in that time, God showed signs and miracles and wonders. In that time, God went and destroyed a generation. In that time, the generation that would begin the process of taking the promised land saw the mighty hand of God. In that time, 2.5 tribes received their inheritance. And they weren't a warrior nation. They were slaves that had wandered the desert for 40 years, and yet they defeated two significant kings. And then, as Joshua comes onto the scene, as the nation falls under Joshua's leadership, and enslaved people who had become a free people now become warriors. And God is with them, and God is winning victories for them. And he makes that clear, that he drove out the Hivites with the hornet. We also see how they fought battles, and this free people got used to fighting war. This free people will eventually give birth to David, to his mighty men, to the armies that will, in combination with God, defeat mighty nations, the Assyrians and others, the Philistines. So the first thing this morning is we cannot discount the previous generation. I need to be careful not to think to myself, their failures, their loss, they did nothing, because the time of that generation did something, even if that generation was lost and failing. The time of that generation did something, prepared something. I think about, if you haven't seen the movie Jesus Revolution, it's very good. There was a revival that happened in the 70s in the United States. And you could argue that in a lot of ways the church had become dry. The church had become resistant to outsiders. The church wasn't willing to accept the hippies until subsections of the church started welcoming this people group, this subculture in, and it started a massive revival. And yet you don't have... Chuck Smith was the person who was one of the key leaders in that move. You don't get a Chuck Smith unless you have a church that he was raised in. You don't get a Chuck Smith unless somebody taught him the Bible. You don't get a Chuck Smith unless he had a mom and a dad or some sort of conversion experience where he came to know Jesus. We can't discount what happened in the previous generation. Regardless of what that previous generation looked like, we can't discount the previous generation. And then what really strikes me is I'm remembering how, I think it was in Joshua 6 or 7, they defeat the Amalekites, and God tells Moses, write this in a book and recite it to Joshua, that I will have war with the Amalekites from generation to generation. And it was specifically directed at Joshua, not the people. It was directed at Joshua. And I think it's because God was preparing Joshua for what's next. And it makes me think, am I living and behaving and acting in such a manner that the next generation is being prepared? Because we see Joshua not only leading the people, we see Joshua not only giving instruction and words from the Lord like Moses gave words from the Lord, but we see Joshua taking on a very military role with the people that Moses only began. And yet we see Joshua flourishing as a military leader, flourishing as a spiritual leader, flourishing as a leader of the nation. But Moses flourished in many of those roles as well, and laid a foundation for Joshua that he's building on. It reminds me of 2 Timothy chapter 2. So Paul is writing to Timothy. My understanding is this is probably shortly before Paul is going to die, or at least Paul thinks he's about to die. And in 2 Timothy 2, he says, "You therefore, my son, be strong in the grace that is in Christ Jesus. The things which you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, entrust these to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. Suffer hardship with me as a good soldier of Christ. No soldier in active service entangles himself in the affairs of everyday life, so that he may please the one who enlisted him as a soldier. Also, if anyone competes as an athlete, he does not win the prize unless he competes according to the rules. The hard-working farmer ought to be the first to receive his share of the crops. Consider what I say, for the Lord will give you understanding in everything." I love these instructions that Paul gives. And verse 2, "The things which you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, entrust these to faithful men who will be able to teach others also." So Paul taught Timothy. So Paul is one generation. Timothy is another generation. And then he tells Timothy, entrust these to faithful men, that's another generation, who will be able to teach others also, that's another generation. Paul is basically Moses. Timothy is basically Joshua. I don't know that we have a lot of record of what Timothy did. We have some record of Timothy. And yet Paul laid a foundation for Timothy to flourish. And the church flourished after the time of the apostles. They went through great persecution, but the church flourished because, and it's really a similar pattern, right? The Christians started out with about 120 people. They were just like Israel. And then Pentecost comes and there's 3,000 of them. And the apostles go and lay a foundation. And then the next generation comes and builds on that foundation, and the church just explodes. The church just grows wildly and massively. And Jesus' last command, what we call the Great Commission, is really looking forward to the next generation as well. It's looking forward to the next. "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I commanded you, and lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age." Now, a disciple could be someone of my generation, and yet typically in Hebrew culture, disciples were younger. It's a little different now, but there's this idea of raising up others to keep doing the work after me. There's this idea of raising up others to do the work. And I think what I'm meditating on, and in my heart, I'm crying out for God to change in me, is that I would start living so that my son does more than me. Or maybe I should say does different than me. Because it's not that Joshua did more than Moses. Joshua did different than Moses. It's just there's one particular area, that of fulfilling the promise, seeing the promise fulfilled, I should say, that Joshua did way more than Moses. Moses never got to go into the land, never got to taste of the land, never got to walk into the promised land. And so he wasn't really, and even the territory of the Reubenites and the Gadites was on the other side of the Jordan. So he didn't really get to enter the promised land. So that portion, he didn't really get to do much in. Joshua flourishes in it. And I think I'm starting, and the seed of a thought is entering my mind, that I need to live my life in such a way that there are things that I will never taste, that I will never partake of, that I will never get to see, but he will. My son will. I didn't become a Christian until I was 21 or 22. I didn't grow up. I grew up with a little bit of the Bible, but I didn't really grow up in church. I was certainly not taught. I wasn't taught to pray. I wasn't taught to worship. I wasn't taught to seek the living God. I wasn't taught to sit quietly in his presence. And my son is going to have a 21-year advantage on me. He's going to have a 21-year advantage. Joshua was serving Moses since he was a young man. When Moses was a young man, he was in Pharaoh's household. He was in Pharaoh's household till he was 40. And then he spent the next 40 years learning to be a shepherd. And then he spent the next 40 years leading Israel. Joshua was Moses' attendant since his youth. Joshua had an 80-year advantage on Moses. I think my question is, who is it that we can give an advantage to today? Who can we give an advantage to today? Is it your children? Is it your spouse? Maybe it's the youth at your church. Maybe it's a colleague at work that's a younger believer. Who can we give an advantage to today? I mean, look at what Moses hands to Joshua. He hands a free people that are ready to take the promised land and that have proven themselves in two significant battles, one or two significant battles. He's handing over to Joshua the law. He's handing over to Joshua the tent of meeting. He's handing over to Joshua the priesthood. He's handing over to Joshua all of these things. Joshua has such a massive advantage. I mean, Moses had to deal with the we should just go back to Egypt. And it says Joshua, although there certainly must have been some struggles, because Joshua said, put away the gods that are amongst you. So there certainly was some idolatry still going on. Moses handed Joshua the covenant. It says that when they got near the promised land, it was Moses or Joshua was instructed to circumcise the people. Moses had to deal with millions of people dying, at least hundreds of thousands in the wilderness, because God said this generation would not inherit the promised land. Joshua, we don't really see those issues come up. We see them not being willing to take their inheritance, so he had problems with the people. But Joshua had a significant advantage. Even the simple fact that Joshua could say, Moses said this, Moses did this. You remember what Moses said, right? I really want to live today to give my son the advantages I didn't have. And I really want to live today so that when he's 6 years old, 10 years old, 12 years old, he's already doing the work that I was doing at 22, 23, 24. I want to live so that when he reaches 20 years old, he's doing the work that I'm doing at 37. I want to live so that when he is 40 years old, he's doing the work that I was doing when I was 30, 25. Sorry, that he's doing the work I'm doing when I'm 60. I want him to have a 20-something year advantage on me. I want to see him take the promised land. I want to live to see him flourish. And then I want to live in such a way that when I go on to be with the Lord one day, I can rest my hand upon his head, and Lord willing, the hands of my grandchildren, and I can proclaim a blessing over them, and I can say, you know the victories that God won in my life. You know the ways that the Lord has transformed me and changed me. You know the man that I was when you were born and you grew up with, and you know that the man that I am today. So as for you, my son, make your choice. Who will you serve today? I want to be able to say that when the time has come. I want to be able to, like Moses, that's Joshua to the Israelites. I want to say, like Moses to Joshua, I want to be able to say, be strong and courageous. Do not let this book of the law leave your mouth, leave your mind, but be strong and courageous and continue the work that has been started. Like Paul, I want to look at my son and say, these words that I have spoken to you, entrust them to your children. Entrust them to others who can teach. I want to live for this next generation. I want to live so that those that come after me have a significant advantage over me. I want to live to see that. How will you live today? How will we live today? For ourselves or for those that will come after us? May the Lord bless you and keep you. May he cause his face to shine upon you.